Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this, the EAA's end of year wrap up for 2021. We thought it would be a great idea to hold this session towards the end of the year. It's been a difficult year on top of another difficult year in 2020 in the world of education and assessment. So we thought it'd be interesting to end with a bit of a wrap up that will look at quite a thought-provoking topic around the connections between using cognitive enhancing drugs and online assessment. And I am delighted to invite Dr. Ellie Dommett to the stage with me. So Ellie is a reader in neuroscience at King's College London. She's Deputy Director for Curriculum for the development of undergraduate psychology and as a teacher in that as well. She's been at King's for 7 years, particularly interested in and a bit of an expert actually in the use of e-learning and technology to support learning delivery. I understand she's also a very keen runner and preparing for a half marathon at the moment, and describes herself, and I really love this description because I am similar to in this as well, as being owned by a greyhound. I'm not owned by a greyhound, but I am definitely owned by our 2 dogs. So absolutely share that sentiment there, and they drive your life. So Ellie, thank you very much for joining us today and for offering us some insight into this session. We're going to have questions for Ellie after her presentation. So if you have got questions, please pop those into the chat in the video feed that you're watching on at the moment. You can also use Twitter to send questions through to our hashtag, which is @eassess. So we'll deal with some questions after Ellie's presented, and then after that I'm going to be making some really interesting and hopefully compelling announcements around our plans for our annual conference and awards program in the coming 12 months. So do stick around for that if you can as well. But at that point, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to hand over to Ellie, and she's going to talk to us around this really interesting topic of cognitive enhancing drugs and online assessment. So Ellie, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk to you about a topic that really has sort of, I think, it's been bubbling away under the surface, but in the situation that we found ourselves in, moving lots of teaching and learning to the online platforms more than we had done previously, I think this is something now that's going to need quite serious consideration. So I guess the first starting point then is what do we mean by cognitive enhancing drugs? So to be really clear here, when I'm talking about cognitive enhancing drugs, I'm not talking about, in this instance, I'm not talking about things like caffeine or your Pro Plus tablets for anyone that remembers those. The definition that I'm working with here is it's a prescription drug that's taken by someone either who doesn't have a prescription at all or they're taking it at a higher dose than they have been prescribed to take it. And their goal when they take this drug is to improve cognitive functions like attention or memory. And more commonly, we hear about people using phrases around boosting concentration or boosting their brain power, which actually, as a neuroscientist, brain power isn't really a thing. But what they tend to be talking about there is things like attention and memory. So these drugs, I think it's important to say these drugs are prescribed for known and accepted medical conditions. So common cognitive enhancers are modafinil and Adderall. Adderall is a brand name for amphetamine. And these 2 drugs are prescribed regularly for individuals with narcolepsy or ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And using them if you have one of those conditions is not classed as using them as a cognitive enhancer. So I kind of find a sort of ladder system is quite helpful here. So we can imagine that somebody with healthy typical cognition might be here on our ladder system, and someone with ADHD or narcolepsy could be a little lower down. So perhaps they're less able to do certain attention tasks, for example. When they take the medication, they are trying to bring themselves up to a level that is comparable to those that don't have the condition. So I'm not talking about people trying to take drugs to create a situation where they are on par with others that don't have a known medical condition. In this case, we're talking about healthy individuals who are taking the drugs to boost themselves above what would be typically found. So that's the kind of difference here. We're not talking about repairing a deficit, we're talking about going higher up from the healthy level. So when we think about these drugs, they are being used by all sorts of people. We know that, the literature tells us that. And by the way, I put the alternative names on the side there. So they're sometimes called smart drugs or just cognitive enhancers or nootropics. I'm going to try and use either cognitive enhancers or smart drugs throughout, but just they are all meant to be the same thing. So in terms of why we're interested in them in the context of assessment is probably because the group of people that have received the most attention in this topic is actually undergraduate students, university students. So what we know is that at a kind of at some universities, and the levels do vary across university, use is thought to be up to 25%. So 1 in 4 students are taking these drugs during their study time. It isn't, as I said, it's not something that's entirely restricted to students, but they are the group that have received the most attention in the research in this area. So then we have to ask ourselves, why is this an issue? Maybe it's just okay to take these drugs. Why are we concerned about them at all? Well, there's several reasons to be concerned, and they sort of fall into the categories shown here. So the first reason is whether they actually work or not. So these drugs have been developed as medicines, and when you're developing a drug as a medicine, you're developing it to be used by a particular clinical population. So perhaps that's a group of people with narcolepsy. That's not to say it has any effects on individuals that don't have those conditions or that it has the same effects. So a kind of perhaps more tangible example here is antidepressants. If you give antidepressants to somebody that isn't depressed, it doesn't make them ecstatically happy. So there's nothing to suggest that giving a drug that can improve attention to somebody that doesn't have an impairment in attention would give them better than normal levels of attention. So there is mainly only data about efficacy, effectiveness in these specific clinical populations. There's actually very little evidence that they work in healthy individuals to deliver the same kind of outcomes, so improved attention or concentration. And arguably, what's more interesting is the evidence that does exist tends to be self-report evidence. So individuals saying, I felt like I attended better when I taken the drug. And of course, there's an awful lot that can be done just on expectation biases. So people expect to feel better. That of course is the basis of things like the placebo effect. So the first area where we might be concerned about the use of these drugs is that there's not really any evidence that they are doing what people think they're doing, or at least there is very limited evidence. The second area is around risk. Of course, all drugs carry a known risk with them. Any substance that we take or put into our body could potentially have side effects. And when we're talking about drugs like amphetamine, those side effects can be quite substantial. And in fact, the reason there is regular debate about the use of amphetamine in ADHD is because some of the side effects are quite serious, related to things like tachycardia, so altered heartbeat, heart rhythms, but also psychosis and more minor headache type symptoms as well. So all drugs carry a risk associated with them, and most of the time that risk is deemed a manageable or an acceptable risk given the potential benefits that can be gained if you're treating a medical condition. If you're not treating a condition in the first place, those risks might not seem quite so minor. Another thing, of course, is that when these drugs are being taken, although the drugs themselves are not all illegal to purchase, they're not being purchased through a doctor when they're used for cognitive enhancers. So just to perhaps touch on some of the legalities here, drugs like modafinil can be legally purchased, but drugs like amphetamine, of course, is a Class B drug that you shouldn't be buying illegally. But of course, if it's prescribed to you and then you're taking it at a higher dose than prescribed, then technically you haven't broken the law in getting the drug. So there are issues around the legality, which add to the risk because people are then buying these drugs online or they're buying them from other individuals who have been prescribed the medication. Around 50% of adults with ADHD, I think it's 50%, report passing on their medication, for example. So in that case, individuals are taking medication without seeing a doctor first, so without having an analysis of the risks. And of course, when they're purchasing the drugs online, they could actually be purchasing anything. There's nothing to say it's actually the drugs that they think they're getting. So efficacy and risk are really quite significant issues with these drugs. But the issue that probably ties closest to the academic context or the learning context in general is the issue around ethics. So when you ask students about what they think of these drugs, they sort of come down on into two halves. There are some that believe it's really unfair, and there are others that kind of say, well, it's no different to other inequalities in the education system. And, I guess the obvious one here is financial cost. Nobody is going to give you a drug for free. So you're going to have the money to purchase that drug. And if you have the money to purchase the drug, you probably also have the money perhaps to um, access extra teaching resources, perhaps tutoring when you're at school or your family, but also being able to buy the latest textbooks or things like that. And certainly, we know from being a university based in London, which of course is an expensive area, that for some students it is a choice of coming onto campus to attend their lectures or paying their food bill that week. And so they have to stay at home and watch lecture capture. So we know there are inequalities in the education system that exist already around finances, and this could be an extra or an exacerbation of those inequalities. And then, as I said, that there are students that think they're fundamentally unfair, that this is akin to cheating. So, because of all of these factors, because of the concerns about effectiveness, the risk that individuals are taking, and of course, universities do have a duty of care to students, but also because of the issues around whether this is making the education experience unequal in some way, or whether it's akin to cheating, like plagiarism, buying your essay from an essay mill, universities arguably should be trying to reduce the use of these cognitive enhancing drugs. So, what might they do to try and reduce the use of drugs? Well, if you think about this issue, but you don't think about it for too long, you might think, oh, well, the obvious thing to do is let's just drugs test students and check they're not using these drugs. But that, of course, is highly unlikely to go down very well with students themselves. But it's also hugely implausible to try and drugs test students for these drugs, especially when in some cases the drugs will be legitimately prescribed to the students, so they'll be in their system. There's also a question of when would you drugs test. So the image shown on the screen here is clearly not an undergraduate student. It's a schematic of a rat on a maze, and rats can do some pretty impressive things. I think on a good day they might outperform some of our undergraduate students, but most of the time they're not doing anything too exciting. In this particular study, what they're asked to do or trained to do is to identify the arms of the maze with a treat in for them, shown as the black blob. And once they've identified that, they then come back a little bit later. So they have a testing and a training phase, and they have to learn in different variations on the task, either to go down the same arms or different arms of the maze they previously looked down. And this task, although it is ultimately sticking a rat on a maze and asking the rat to navigate around the maze, this task tells us about learning and testing phases. So, what we know from research in this area is that the effects of the drugs don't seem to just be a kind of blanket improvement, even in animal studies like this, where the measures are very simple. It does seem to be dependent a little bit on whether the individual is exposed to the drug in both phases or neither phase. So it seems if there is um, a mismatch between the drug status in the learning phase and the testing phase, then it may not actually be beneficial. It could even be worse for them in terms of their learning outcomes. So, because there are nuances around when having the drugs in the system could be beneficial or not, it could be really tricky to know when would you test students. If you were to test students, when would you do it? Would you be doing it when they enter the exam hall, or should you be doing it at spot checks during the revision period? In terms of universities, at least, there doesn't seem to be as yet any clear policies on this coming out of universities. There are, of course, policies around behaviours that could get you disciplined or even expelled from a university, and some of those will relate to drugs, but they don't relate to the use of cognitive enhancing drugs specifically. And particularly at the moment, most studying and assessment is typically done off campus, so you can't assess a student's drug status if they're not physically on the campus. In this case, we're still seeing students studying at conventional campus universities from another country, and that, of course, may continue for a little while yet. But even when we're in a more typical situation than we're in now, students will be on campus or potentially, using university buildings, probably for the minority of their time. A lot of their studying will be done in their accommodation, whether that's the family home, private rental, or university accommodation, and we cannot keep an eye on them all the way through. So from that, we know that, just from this brief outline, it's clear that it's going to be nearly impossible to control and monitor use in that way. So it's unlikely to be enough to stop individuals taking these drugs, simply saying that we might try some of this monitoring, even if we could get it accepted and into policy. It's unlikely to be that helpful. So if we can't do it that way, we have to look at the other way to do it. More than one way to skin tiddles, as my one of my old colleagues used to say. And if we can't prevent use in a kind of heavy-handed way, then arguably the easiest thing to do, the next thing to do, is to try and just simply make use less appealing. Um, and to do that, we have to understand why people might use these drugs in the first place. And understanding that in itself can be quite tricky, because you have to ask people if they're using them, and people have to be willing to admit to it. And some of these drugs, of course, in the case of things like amphetamine, they are illegal drugs. So one of the things that we tend to do in this kind of research is anonymous surveys. There's no reason to think that people will lie in anonymous surveys. They have no benefit to lying, but obviously we do have to be mindful that where the data is anonymous, we can't be verifying it. It's also self-reported data. But what we do know from this kind of study is that there's no particular age group that are more at risk. This isn't hugely surprising because the undergraduate age range, or even if you take into account undergraduates and postgraduate students, is not a hugely big age range. We do know that males are more likely to choose to take these drugs than females. At King's, at least, the most popular choice of drug was modafinil. So that was the one that most people reported using. But we also know that most of them reported very seldom use. So this isn't like they're going out, um, you know, at the weekend and getting all their, perhaps going out and doing paid work because they have to have employment, and then realizing they still haven't written their essay. So every Sunday night they're taking their modafinil to work through to submit essays. It seems to be that there might be particular pinch points where they feel they have to take these drugs, and it's certainly not something they're doing regularly. So we know that around users and non-users from anonymous surveys. But of course, sample sizes of users is going to be relatively low if you think that perhaps 1 in 4 students are taking them, but you very rarely get a survey where the entire population of a university or student population of an area complete the survey. So we don't have huge sample sizes here. So one thing we can do instead is we can say, well, okay, everybody has an attitude towards these drugs, even if they're not taking them. And we know that the attitude somebody has will predict their intention, and intention will predict use in this case. So let's have a look at what determines whether somebody has a positive or negative attitude towards these drugs. When we look at this, we can see, so I've done the classic traffic light system here, which is also very unhelpful if anybody's colorblind, so I apologize for that. But we know that individuals who are male have a more positive attitude towards the drugs. Individuals who perceive the drugs to be harmless also have a more positive attitude. They also people with positive attitudes tend to think they know enough about the drugs to make a safety judgment. And that's an interesting one because actually we did follow-up work where we worked with both users and non-users and assessed their knowledge of the safety of modafinil, and found that although the users felt they knew more, the reality was they didn't. And in fact, both groups had pretty poor safety knowledge of the drugs. But certainly if an individual thinks they have enough knowledge to make a safety judgment, they are more likely to have a positive attitude. We also know that individuals who are more competitive are more likely to take these drugs. And then finally, thinking about learning approaches, individuals with a more surface learning approach, so that's where they are interested in often sort of memorizing and almost rote rehearsal of things rather than developing a deep understanding. It's often the learning approach, if you're not familiar with it, it's often the one that people criticize. In reality, most of the time we need to adopt some surface learning and some deep learning, but for the individuals that are motivated to adopt this approach, they tend to be more in favor of smart drugs. We've done other work and shown that there's been no effects of things like your intelligence beliefs or your morality beliefs on whether you're likely to have a positive attitude towards the drugs. So there's lots of factors that might drive a positive attitude, but in terms of factors that drive a negative attitude, it does come down to perceived unfairness. So people won't take these drugs if they think it's offering them an unfair advantage, or that others using them, the flip side of that is they wouldn't want others to have access to a drug that gives them an unfair advantage over them. But also academic performance. So the stronger students are less likely to take these drugs. Now, that of course could be because they either feel more able to to complete the work to a good standard without the drugs, or potentially they are more able because they have developed appropriate study skills, for example. So those study skills allow them to tackle the task without enhancers. So these factors then do tell us a little bit about what we could do to reduce smart drug use, given what we know about attitudes and intentions towards them. Some of these, of course, or I should say, the ideas that I'm going to share here are ideas that are good for many other reasons as well, but they could also potentially help reduce the likelihood of taking drugs. So, what we can't do is we can't suddenly say, well, we'll only take female students and we will make sure that they all perceive the right level of harm and they all perceive that they don't know anything about safety. To an extent, of course, you can raise awareness of the risks of these drugs, and that is absolutely something that's worth doing. But it's better to tap in as a university, recognizing that the only contact points we have with students is their, guaranteed contact points is through their teaching. It might be worth trying to look at what can be changed there. And so that taps into the competitiveness and the service learning. So, what could we do to reduce competition or this sense of competitiveness in our students? I guess one of the most important things that is an area that always comes up regularly, kind of coming around in the debates, is to reduce the reliance on grades. And this is a really tricky thing to do. I think many people working in teaching and learning are like the idea in principle of a reduced reliance on grades. The reality is it can be quite tricky to implement, not least because students expect grades. And by the time they come to a university level of education, they have had this kind of grade approach very much drilled into them. So if we don't give them a grade, they actually get quite annoyed about it. So if we could reduce the amount of grades, that would be good. And this could be a balance, of course, of potentially increasing formative but decreasing summative assessment, or really emphasizing that a need for assessment of for learning, not of learning. Also, one of the things that tends to come around that, of course, is underpinned by competition is this idea of normative marking that, we have a cohort, the top 10% will get a first, so you need to be in that top 10%, as opposed to we have a cohort and the ones that meet a particular criteria, all of them will get a first, all of them will get a 2-1. So perhaps better communicating where normative marking is or isn't being used and why could be quite helpful. So that may be one way of reducing competition. Another way could be to emphasize the need for collaboration, both in learning and assessment. So, adopting methods of teaching that require the students to work together can reduce a sense of competition and develop. They will become more aware, hopefully, of the benefits of collaboration and stop seeing their peers as competition for a top grade and start seeing them as another means or channel to develop their own learning and to improve, so to work with each other. Online assessment has really come into its own in the last well, I mean, not since the pandemic, actually, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, it's really come into its own. And the ability to work collaboratively online is huge. So being able to set collaborative assessments and putting those in an online medium is a really good way to get students to work together. And of course, sometimes you can have groups of students or individuals working together that have actually never met and are randomly allocated to a group. So there is no expectation about, well, that person's going to be better than me. And you can actually almost remove, you don't necessarily want to, but you can almost remove the individual identities if all assessment or collaboration is online. Of course, when you're doing that, there is a need to be careful because if, especially for any online activity, if the students don't have the relevant digital skills, they could end up becoming more stressed, and that could be more of a driver, for example, to take drugs to support their study. So that's how we could reduce competition, but could we do anything to improve the level of learning, so shifting from surface to deeper learning? Well, we know that students will tend to default, even if they're happy with deep learning methods, we know they'll default to surface learning if the amount of content is unmanageable or if it's just far too tricky. We also know, of course, that you need to challenge students as part of the learning process, challenge them intellectually, but making sure that there is this fine line between volume and level and challenge can ensure a better approach to learning in the sense that it could be a deeper approach. We also often sort of set up our activities and we don't necessarily, we're encouraging students to read around the subject, but actually we haven't necessarily left them any time to do that in the workload planning of a module. So if we schedule time for them to have that time to either read around or perhaps if they're not as confident to revisit as much of the material as they need to, that might shift them away from surface learning as well. Self-assessment activities help, and of course, they don't even have to be labeled as assessment activities, but mini quizzes, um, reflective activities, discussions, online or in person, of course, can all help them reflect on whether they understand a topic, which can help promote deep learning. We also know that there is literature that suggests certain types of assessment method are more likely to support a student taking a deeper approach. So the classic dichotomy is the multiple choice question supports surface learning, whereas an essay question supports deep learning. And although I say that's a classic thing, of course, if your multiple choice questions require them to apply their knowledge to novel situations, then that's not necessarily the case. But it's about designing assessment that relies on application or understanding, not memory. And then a relatively less well investigated area is the effect of feedback. So we do know that students will change how they approach their learning in response to their feedback experiences. So if somebody gives them just a grade and nothing else, they may think, okay, I'm just going to do surface learning. But if they're getting written feedback, they may be more likely to take a deep learning approach. So as well as those ideas, I guess one of the sort of bonus ideas that I would suggest is that we know these students aren't using these drugs on a regular basis. We know they're not. We know there must be a trigger or a pinch point. And that suggests that they're using them when they have a particularly busy schedule, when they're particularly stressed, or perhaps they've got lots of assessments due in at any one point in time. So on that basis, I would suggest that the best approach is, of course, to look at workload across what the student is experiencing and take it from there rather than try to sort of deal with it on a module basis. Of course, that's nearly impossible across a whole degree program, but it may be possible across specific cohorts. So that's, I've got some useful sources there in case anybody wants to follow up with anything, but that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellie. That was a great presentation and some really interesting stuff there. And to be honest, a lot to unpick. And I feel like we probably need another half an hour to talk about some of the stuff you've raised there. But it was really, really interesting. And thank you very much for sharing that with us. If you are interested in understanding a little bit more about this area, it's worth noting that the Victus blog featured a podcast with Ellie in July. I've popped the link there on the bottom of that slide. So if you do want to have, to find out a little bit more about this and to listen to Ellie in a more of a conversational setting talking about this area, then I do recommend that you visit that blog and listen to the podcast. But we have got some questions that have come in from the audience. So Ellie, if you don't mind, we'll just spend maybe 5 minutes talking through some of these. So we had a question from Fiona. She says, I was just wondering how it could be proved that drugs work and so become appealing. Could it be that people who have undiagnosed ADHD have found them useful? Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean that's a big issue, of course, especially when you're talking about student populations who are typically over the age of 18, and we know that adult diagnosis of things like ADHD is not necessarily perhaps as common as it is to diagnose someone as a child. So it could be that, but I think as well that we do. It's a bit like many of these things that when someone tries something, they think it helps them. They tell other
Mm.
people, and that actually we need an objective measure of something, and the objective measures aren't really there at the moment. So I think it is a case of one person tries something, they say, yeah, yeah, it worked for me. Well, actually, maybe it just worked for them because they subconsciously put in more effort because they wanted to believe that they could now achieve something. So yeah, it is tricky, and certainly some of the people probably will have um, undiagnosed conditions that perhaps benefit a little from these drugs.
And you do wonder, actually, just thinking about that, whether that whole peer pressure piece and word of mouth plays to this too. That, as you say, if there's no empirical evidence that it actually has a positive impact, it doesn't really matter in the eyes of the students. If someone says that was fantastic, it really helped me focus, then maybe others will emulate that and try it as well. So it is a tricky thing. And I guess that leads on to the next question that's been put in the chat, which is we were wondering whether there was any awareness of companies targeting students with marketing for drugs in the same way that we've seen around essay mills and other cheating services.
Not so far that I'm aware, but I suspect if they're doing their targeting carefully, I won't be in the demographic on social media that would see them. So not that I'm aware, and not that we've heard from students. Um, we haven't explicitly asked that question. We have asked them if they're aware of users, if they're aware of availability or accessibility of these drugs, but we haven't heard if they're sort of targeting them. We do know they'll target, of course, we see it with other non-cognitive enhancing things like the energy drinks are clearly targeting a particular market. So it's possible that if you're in the right demographic, you're seeing some of these things that I wouldn't see and that no one's told us about yet. And the problem is, I think it's a bit like the essay meals. No student's going to go to their personal tutor or their lecturer and say, every time I log on to Twitter or every time I'm on Instagram, I'm getting all these promoted ads for
Mm.
these drugs that are meant to help me study. So I suspect they are out there, but I don't think it's widespread kind of legitimate advertising by companies.
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you. Another question here. What level of awareness about this issue are there within the HE sector, and is there a concern about it? So, are universities broadly aware of this as an issue, and do they care? Maybe that's too hard, but
Yeah.
is there a worry about it?
I mean, yeah, I think they absolutely are aware, and I would say they are concerned about it, and they're concerned from both perspectives. I mean, obviously, if students are taking drugs and there's a risk, they're concerned that if something happens to the student, there is not only potentially loss of life or serious illness to a student, but there's also reputational damage. But I think they are mainly concerned about the idea of academic conduct and cheating. And I think concern was rising pre-pandemic, and then with everything else that's changed, I think it's just kind of fallen off the radar. There is a
Mm,
lot of concern around student mental health, of course, across the sector, and that tends to focus on. So when they're looking at some of the issues around that, it tends to focus on use of drugs and alcohol to manage or self-medicate. So of course that's a different kind of drug use, although in reality they can be the same drugs but just taken for a different purpose. So I think there is concern. I think there is definitely awareness of it. I don't think it's on the top of the radar at the moment because of the massive issues around student mental health in general, and then of course what's happened in the sector since COVID.
Yeah, as you say, juggling an awful lot of priorities right now, so it's understandable. So another interesting question here is about so what would be the lead indicators of a drug that actually did help students achieve better performance in exams? Has any of your research touched on looking at that?
So I guess in terms of this is a really tricky one because what exactly they'd be doing in an exam is going to be sort of critical in answering that question. I mean, I suppose what you would expect is that they would be able to learn things more quickly um, in preparation. So often it isn't about what the student does in the exam; it's often about cramming for the exam. So once they're in the exam setting, them, actually sitting in an exam hall or whatever they're doing for their exam, that would almost be the same. It's more about their ability to cram a lot of learning into a small space in time. So if you're looking for a drug that can do that, then you're actually looking for a drug effectively that can reduce the time to learn a particular task. And we do know that things like amphetamine can do that. But what we tend to know, and that most of that research has come from animal studies, and the doses used would be the doses that are associated with um, drug abuse in the sense of addiction, rather than taking it as a smart drug. There's all sorts of issues around this as well. So although that this kind of research is best done in non-human individuals initially, um, your average lab rat won't swallow a pill with its breakfast. So you have to administer the drug normally through an injection, and that changes the pharmacodynamics of it completely to how it would be taken by a person. And that's an added complication that means we haven't really got to grips with this. That and the fact that learning for a person is a far more complex task than it is for an animal. Um, there will be data out there, but it will often be, I suspect, data from control groups in clinical studies. So it's not available in and of itself, but only in comparison to the clinical groups.
Wonderful, thank you. And one last question, and I have to ask this one because I was sitting next to someone at a conference a couple of weeks ago talking about this very topic because he had signed up, the person I was sitting next to come along. And he said, well, look, I don't let my children drink Red Bull because I believe that that's not a positive thing for them to do. Do you think, I know you said right at the beginning, this wasn't about Red Bull and caffeine and that kind of thing, but is that the start of a slippery slope potentially that says, well, it's okay for me to drink Red Bull and to take, lots of strong coffee before I sit down and study or have an exam? Is that an excuse that then leads into potentially more serious drug abuse?
I mean, the short answer is in terms of research, we don't know. The long answer is I would be quite cautious about that. We talk about the gateway effect. It particularly comes up in the literature around whether cannabis is a gateway drug to harder drugs like heroin, for example. And there's all sorts of ideas and research that could say, okay, well, yes, if you smoke cannabis, you are more likely to take other drugs, but that might just be because you know where to get them where you didn't
Sure.
before. But also, there's plenty of evidence that people might smoke cannabis and never go on to take any other drugs. And I think, so I think the idea of something being a gateway is probably quite unlikely. I suspect in this case with cognitive enhancers, I suspect that one thing that probably is more important in the equation is, you know, I for example am an avid Red Bull drinker. I cannot function. My fridge currently has 24 cans of Red Bull in it. Um, I don't smoke. I don't drink coffee or tea. I don't drink alcohol, and I certainly don't take drugs. So I think it's, there will be people that will have certain boundaries, and the legality side of it, I suspect, is a big thing. So where Red Bull and caffeine are legal, some of these drugs aren't. But the other side of it is, are you taking the coffee or having the can of Red Bull, but then studying effectively because you have the study skills? Or are you having to do that because you don't have the study skills? And it's the
Yes.
only way you can sit for long enough. And if it's the latter, I'd be worried. If it's the former, I wouldn't think it's a route um, into using cognitive enhancers.
Okay, great. There are more questions in the chat, but unfortunately, we are not going to have time really to talk about them in any detail here. If you do have questions for Ellie, then I think Ellie did put up on her closing slide her email address. I will also make sure that the Well, there you go. Thank you, Tim. The questions that have been asked in the chat get forwarded to Ellie as well, so that she gets an opportunity to answer those, and we'll post those out, the answers to those out on Twitter in connection with the with promoting the recording of this presentation. So we're going to have to leave it there. Ellie, thank you very much. For what was a really thought-provoking presentation. Knew it would be, having chatted to you beforehand, but it was fantastic. So thank you very much for your time. And do hang around for the next 5 or 10 minutes while we just talk about some of the stuff that we've got coming up next year.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, so now to take a moment to reflect a little more generally on what the association has been up to. And for those of you who aren't aware of the association, you may have come across us. This may be the first time you've come across us because of this particular event. We're a professional membership body that's focused on everything about supporting and promoting the use of technology in assessment, and that's both formative and summative assessment. We're based in the UK, but we have an increasing international presence, and it's really interesting to see where people are joining us today from. You know, we've got someone from Brazil joining us, and then obviously people within the UK as well, and I'm sure lots of other locations as well. So it's a really growing community of people interested in supporting the world of technology and assessment. And if you do want to join us, if you're not already a member, there's a link there on the slide to our membership sign up. It's a free service in terms of becoming a member. You can just go to the website e-assessment.com, and then there's a join button on the right hand side. So please do join us if this is an area that you're interested in and want to know more about and want to become part of a community. It is worth pointing out that because we don't charge for membership, we rely quite heavily on support from a range of commercial sponsors. We have 25 commercial sponsors in supporting the association and what we do, and those organisations' logos are on the screen at the moment. We're really grateful to all the support that our sponsors have given us over the last 10 or 12 years, but particularly over the last couple of years, which has been a difficult time for everybody, and where the EAA has been trying to provide some guidance and support to a whole range of stakeholders in how to get the most out of using technology to support assessment. So thank you very much to all of our sponsors. Just a quick retrospect in terms of what we've been up to in the last 12 months. The highlight of our year each year is our conference and awards. This year, as in 2020, we had the challenge of delivering that entirely online, whereas it would normally have been certainly the conference, a face-to-face event. But it actually, particularly this year, was a really good thing because it helped us to be really inclusive in terms of how we were engaging with that wider sector across the world. And it's interesting, if you look at the awards, you know, we had entries from 16 different countries around the world, and we ended up with 21 finalists, and they came from 9 different countries. We had finalists in India, in Australia. We had 2 in Australia, in the UK, obviously, and in Ireland. So a really international flavour, which is one of the benefits of this virtual format. There are downsides around not being able to network so easily, but there's definitely a benefit around inclusion and wider reach. And that was true with our conference as well this year. So this year we ran the conference as a series of 4 virtual events that were built around 4 themes that you can see on the screen there. And we had delegates joining from 53 different countries, representing nearly 250 individual organisations, which is a fantastic achievement. And I do want to say a big thank you at this point to all the people behind the scenes who worked tirelessly to organise the conference, particularly Karen Pernice, who many of you will know is the EAA's Marketing and Events Manager, but also to Tim Burnett, to Gareth Hopkins, and to others within the EAA board who have given their time to support the conference and the awards programme, and also to all of our judges. So we have 28 judges who work in small teams of usually 3 or 4 to judge each of the different categories of the awards, and they give their time completely voluntarily. And having been involved in one of those judging teams this year for the first time, I really got a sense of how much time and effort they need to put in. So thank you once again to our judges. So that was last year. What about the year coming up? So we're going to be doing our conference again, obviously. This year, fingers crossed, and hopefully, we will be back to offering a face-to-face main focus for our conference. But we're very clear that we want to keep a hybrid element to the conference for all the reasons I was talking about a minute ago, so that we can get that wider engagement. So we're going to try to build a hybrid event through the conference. The main annual conference, the e-assessment conference, will take place in London as a face-to-face event on the 21st and 22nd of June, and there'll be a gala dinner on the middle evening. But we're also going to look at ways of bringing delegates in virtually to that conference. The awards program has always been traditionally delivered as a virtual event, and that will continue. And we have a series of 3 events planned, virtual events planned in May around the different themes of the conference categories. So on the 10th, the 17th, and the 14th of May, culminating in that gala awards dinner, which will take place at the conference venue in London. We're also doing a range of other bits of activity through the year, and I've picked out just a few to highlight. We're heavily involved in the BET show. So for those of you who aren't aware, the BET show takes place in London in January. Didn't take place this year because of the pandemic, but they're hoping that it will take place face-to-face in January this coming year. We've been invited to deliver 4 sessions that are focused around e-assessment. I won't read them out there, they're on the screen for you to see. If any of you are going along to BET, then please do come and join us for those sessions, because I think there's a great opportunity there to engage with a wider range of stakeholders within the broader market. BET is now the largest educational technology show in the world, attracts 40,000+ visitors over the 3 days, from right across the sector, schools to universities and to work-based learning. So really fantastic opportunity for us to take that e-assessment agenda to a wider audience. And then we'll be complementing that activity and the conference and the awards programs with a range of webinars and podcasts, and hopefully some face-to-face regional events as well through the year. We often co-host webinars and podcasts with some of our sponsors. We've got one of those coming up with Talview, one of our gold sponsors, around remote proctoring this week on Friday. So a range of those kind of activities will happen through the year as well. So really, hopefully, exciting year coming up of some face-to-face interaction, but complemented by that virtual interaction with the wider range of stakeholders through the year. So really do encourage you to get involved in that. There'll be more details going out through social media and stuff around the conference, but the conference site is up and running. You can go to the main EAA website, so e-assessment.com/conference to find out more. There's the link on the screen. So do find out more about that and try and do come along and get involved in the conference if you can. The awards, if you're involved in a project where people are using technology in assessment, then do consider submitting an entry to the awards. It's a great way of sharing best practice and exemplifying really good examples and lessons learned through the use of technology in assessment. So there you go. That's a quick run through of what we've been up to and what we've got planned. Really, I want to end this by wishing everybody seasonal wishes for the time of year. So, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a very Happy New Year from us all at the EAA. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you found the presentation from Ellie as interesting and thought-provoking as I did. So we'll end there. Thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you at other EAA events in either the remote proctoring event later this week or in the new year at BET and at the conference and through the awards program. So thank you very much. And we look forward to speaking to you all again very soon.